This isn't the start of a new quarter, but because Bryce has left, we are going to start a new class for the next 6 to 7 weeks before the, third quarter officially starts. So Clay is going to open us with a word of prayer. Thank you for that. Let's go ahead and start with a bit of a thought-provoking story or some sort of thing just to get our minds wrapped around the situation at play here. So here's the scenario. You open your door and there's a young man about age 17 standing in your doorway. This young man has come a long way. He has a really poor relationship with his family, and he asks if he can stay with you. After talking with the man, you learn that he is the son of a family of Christians from Texas. He shows up at your doorstep and he asks if he can stay with you. He says he has a really poor relationship with his family. What are you doing in this situation? This is open for discussion. Young man, 17, shows up at your doorstep. He asks if he can stay with you. You talk to him, you learn he has a really poor relationship with his family, and you realize that his father is a leader in a church community down in Texas. How are you handling the situation? Anyone else? Thoughts? So let's extend the story just a little bit. You let this young man stay with you for a period of time. This man was not a Christian when he shows up at your doorstep, but through living with you for a few days and a few weeks, he learns the gospel, he's baptized, and then he stays with you a couple more weeks, and you realize he is a great worker in the kingdom. He's 17 years old. He gets really involved in our high school community. He does a lot of work in our high school Bible studies. He teaches others the gospel. He even volunteers to lead an invitation, and he's working and doing really great things in the kingdom. So now this 17-year-old man who's still staying with y'all, still has a poor relationship with his family, is now doing wonderful work in the kingdom and contributing a lot to our church family at Ellisville. Does this change our answer to how we approach the situation, or is our mindset towards the situation still the same? Jake mentioned a key phrase there that I think is really interesting. That's family business, because that might be your first instinct too, which is, this sounds like it's a family issue. It sounds like something y'all should work out personally. Don't bring the church into it. Don't bring other Christians into it. Just handle it between y'all two. Go home. Don't bring me into this. And we see when we actually dive into the scriptures, it's sort of the opposite approach that the Apostle Paul takes. So obviously, over the next 6-7 weeks, we're going to be talking about this book called Philemon. And we're going to start every class on Philemon by reading the book of Philemon, the entire book of Philemon. That might throw you off at first, but this is only 25 verses. It's Paul's shortest letter in the New Testament, and so because of that, it's located at the very end of Paul's letters. It's really hard to find because most of your Bibles probably have it on one page. So if you have your Bible with you right now, let's open to the letter from Paul to Philemon, and if I can get a volunteer to read those 25 verses, that would be great. That's it. That's the entire letter from Paul to Philemon, handling this entire situation. Now, as you can tell, the situation is a little different from the one we described, but there's a lot of unknowns in the story as well, and we'll sort of get into some of those. But the critical question I want us to consider throughout this entire first class in this series is sort of, what is this letter about? Why is it in our Bibles is another good way of answering that question, because as you read it, it might seem like it's a family matter, it's a personal matter. This has really maybe nothing to do with these big spiritual sort of takeaways that you get from a book like Romans or Hebrews or even Colossians, as we just finished. This book is a personal matter, but through this personal matter, we can sort of see takeaways on how we should live our lives as Christians. So the first slide I have for y'all is a quote from this book, and sort of this whole class was sort of spurred on because David McClister, I don't know if any of y'all know him, he's a professor at Florida College. He published this new commentary and sort of book talking about the letter from Paul to Philemon, and he talks about it through the lens of relationships in the Messianic time. So during this time, which was very different than ours, very different culture than ours, all these players in this letter have different relationships with each other. And we're sort of going to look at the book through those different relationships and ultimately how those characters grow in their relationship with Christ through this situation. So if you see DM or if you see big long block quotes, it's probably a little citation at the bottom. It's probably from this book, which is A Commentary on Philemon by David McClister. So this first quote, what is this book about? David writes, "What could such a short letter about a mostly individual matter have to teach us today? Plenty, as it turns out. The New Testament documents are like historical photographs of moments in the history of the early church. In these documents, we see Christians struggling with the implications of the new faith, dealing with resistance from without and sometimes within, and learning how to put their beliefs into practice all at the same time." So by reading this letter, we can't answer every historical question that's raised through these letters, but we can sort of derive these principles from this letter that can affect how we live our life today. So the letter writing format is really interesting. So this is only one chapter, 25 verses, I mentioned, the shortest letter written by Paul. And the fact that it's a letter, I think, is really interesting because in this sort of letter format that Paul uses throughout the New Testament, we get a very unique look into the situation. Just in general, it's very different from having like a text message conversation where there's constant back and forth, and you can sort of read through a whole string of conversations. It's very different than a book like Acts or the Gospel, where there's sort of a historical person coming in and detailing, interviewing eyewitnesses and getting the whole account of what's going on. It's different from a phone conversation. If there was a recorded phone conversation between Paul and Philemon, the conversation and the argument presented by Paul might look very different. But because it's a letter, we sort of get a unique look into the situation. So a few different things. One, in sending the letter, there's an implied previous relationship between the sender and the recipient. And we see hints of that throughout the letter, is that Paul clearly knows Philemon, prizes a new moment or event in that relationship. So they have this whole long previous relationship, but now something has happened. And so there's a new moment, and this relationship is going to change. Third, the letter implies at least one future stage in the relationship, namely a recipient's response. So by sending this letter and appealing to Philemon, he's sort of assuming that Philemon is going to respond in some way, either purely through his actions or by the sending of another letter, which we don't have. We don't know how Philemon responded to this. 4, the parties involved in the correspondence are related to each other in a complex web of roles, positions, and statuses which are in play. So we'll sort of dive into this in future classes, not as much today, but not only do they have a previous relationship, as we said, but the relationship has certain roles and responsibilities associated with it. Paul is an apostle in the church, and that comes with a certain level of authority over someone like Philemon, who might be an elder or might be someone who's just hosting a church in his household. And that relationship is also very different between Philemon and Onesimus, who is kind of our main character in here, although he doesn't say a single word. We just see his views through Paul writing about him. But Onesimus is a bondservant. He's essentially a slave of Philemon. And so that relationship, coupled with the relationship between Paul and Philemon, sort of sets up this really complex web of relationships that we're going to dive into over the next few weeks. 5, the way the letter is crafted, including its argumentation, tone, etc., corresponds to the sender's understanding of his relationship to the recipient. So Paul will sort of write in a way assuming that the relationship that he left off is sort of the same relationship as in the present moment. So it's a whole complex sort of web of relationships going on here. So our 3 main characters, if you sort of take God out of it, we'll get to that point: Philemon, Onesimus, and Paul. And these people were sort of interacting in a really interesting way. So Philemon, we don't really know who these characters are that are sort of mentioned. Let's see. It's in the beginning. In verse 1 and 2, Philemon sort of mentions Epipha, who may have been Philemon's wife. We don't necessarily know. And Archippus, who may have been Philemon's son. And the letter is actually addressed to the whole church or the whole ministry that's taking place in his home. So this is, it's a personal matter, it's a family matter, But theoretically, Paul is also not just talking to Philemon, but also bringing in Philemon's wife and Philemon's son and sort of addressing all of them and the entire church in this letter. And secondly, Philemon is clearly a good dude. I know it's sort of, hard to look at someone who owned other human beings, owned bondservants, and say, in today's terms, that was a good person. But Paul really commends this person. In sort of the second section, so verses 4 through 7, there's a lot of talk about all the great things Philemon is doing. This quote is from the ESV Study Bible, but it says, Philemon was well known for his love for his fellow believers, which brought Paul great joy. He had been actively involved in ministering to other Christians in a way that had profoundly encouraged them. Like, that sounds like a good dude. So Philemon is not the bad guy in this letter by any means. He is essentially, for as much as we know about him, a strong and faithful Christian who is potentially shepherding an entire church in his household. So really interesting. Onesimus. The name Onesimus means useful or profitable and was frequently given to bondservants. So Onesimus isn't some sort of personal name like John or Luke or David. Onesimus is sort of this general term that sort of means useful or profitable. So it's sort of a generic title given to bondservants, which I think is really interesting. And it raises a whole lot of additional questions that we don't have answers to, such as how long had Onesimus been a bondservant? Was he a free person before then who sort of sold off or got into great debt and then became a bondservant? Was he a bondservant from a very young age and was always known as Onesimus? We don't have answers to any of those questions, but they're important things to keep in the back of our mind. The ESV Study Bible also says that Onesimus not only ran away from Philemon, but probably took money from him as well. This would have provided him the means to purchase passage to Rome and to live there for a time. And McClister talks about how Philemon is not necessarily in Colossae. We'll talk about that today. And Paul is not necessarily in Rome, although many commentators just sort of assume those things. But either way, to go from his home to wherever Paul was currently imprisoned would have taken money, would have taken capital. And so a lot of people sort of assume as well that when Onesimus ran away from Philemon, he probably stole something from him as well, probably money. So that's sort of what's going on with Onesimus. And finally, Paul, he was in a state of imprisonment. Scholars are sort of divided over where that imprisonment was, whether it was the Roman imprisonment or it was a separate, maybe brief imprisonment that was not mentioned in the book of Acts. We don't necessarily know, but it's important to note that Paul is currently in prison during this time. And then it's important to note that also Paul says he became like a father to Onesimus. In our story in the very beginning, this 17-year-old comes living in your home, and he's there long enough and working with you in the gospel long enough that genuinely you feel like this person is your son, like as much part of the family as your own children. Now, obviously, Paul doesn't have children, but you see he gets very close with his fellow workers in the gospel, and so he clearly feels a lot of love and affection for Onesimus, and they're very close. This isn't someone who just showed up at Paul's doorstep and Paul immediately writes this letter and says, go back home. No, Onesimus was here for an extended period of time, long enough to learn the gospel and become a Christian, and also long enough to prove that his usefulness in the gospel is significant. And so Paul definitely feels a lot of love and compassion for Onesimus. So these are our three main characters, and you can already sort of see how they relate to one another in a really complex and interesting way. So the next thing we sort of have to talk about briefly is our connection to Colossians. I know we just studied this book, and so it's important to note that there's sort of a reason why we did these two classes back to back is because they do have a lot of connection. The only other place that Onesimus is mentioned in the entire Bible is in the letter to the Colossians. So if you want to turn there with me, turn to Colossians chapter 4. I think it's also on the board behind me so you can see it right there. But actually, can I get a reader? Colossians 4, 7 through 9. Yeah, so not only do we have this complex web of relationships, but we can see that Onesimus eventually leaves Paul. He goes with Tychicus, and he shows up in Colossae. And we don't know if that's where Philemon was. Like I said, we'll get to that a little bit later. But we can see that Onesimus is carrying this letter in his hand. And you can see that he is going to deliver this letter personally to Philemon when he comes back home. And so I want to talk about this just for a brief moment and sort of think about what you think that interaction was like, sort of thinking about the end game, because it's hard to sort of dissect this letter unless we understand the final confrontation that's going to take place when Onesimus returns back to his master, Philemon, after running away, after potentially stealing from him, after becoming a Christian. You have to have that sort of interaction back again. And not only is there potential consequences for that, but then he hands a letter from Paul. And it's sort of a kind of a dramatic moment to think about. So I want to turn it open to y'all. What do you think this interaction was like? How do you think Onesimus felt in this moment? And then finally, do you have an example of a time when you might have felt like Onesimus or Philemon in a situation similar to this? I think that's, we'll have a whole class sort of talking about that idea of reconciliation and what it means to reconcile in a specific situation like this. So yeah, it's a huge sort of part of the letter, even though it's not explicitly stated, is this whole letter is sort of about reconciliation at the end of the day, is that there's a master and a servant, but also just two Christian brothers who have strife with one another. And Paul says, I want you to continue doing good work with me, but you have to be reconciled first. Yeah, that's huge. I don't think we're going to talk about that today, but I think we're probably going to have a whole class diving into sort of that concept, which is Paul knows he can command him. He says there, I could command you to do this. I could say, fix the situation. As an apostle in Christ, I demand that you do this. But there's something sort of deeper going on, and sort of the idea of reconciliation along with it too is that's not how you get reconciliation. If you've ever been a parent and you have two kids that are fighting, and you go to one of the kids and say, go apologize to your sister now. Like, I'm forcing you to go and apologize. And that can be effective, to an extent. But what you really want is for that child's heart to be pricked to say, I need to go and apologize. Not because my, dad is over my shoulder forcing me to go, but because I genuinely sort of want that reconciliation. Yeah, that's huge. It's a change in heart. So one of the other reasons how we know that this letter was delivered by Onesimus directly into the hands of Philemon is sort of the general idea of letter writing as a concept. So David McClister writes, there was a form that most letters generally followed. It began with the sender's name, then the name of the recipients, followed by a greeting, then followed by the body of the letter, with a closing at the end. The amount of detail in the letter varied because the courier, the person carrying the letter, could communicate some information in person. I think that's an important thing to note as well, is you might think if Onesimus really did steal money and run away and harmed Philemon in some way, there has to be an apology. And Paul never says in this letter, Onesimus is really sorry, he feels bad about what he did, he repented and became a Christian. It's not included. And we don't know this for a fact, this is pure speculation, but understanding the history and the time and sort of the name of the book, relationships during this messianic time, is that when Philemon delivers the letter, there's probably an oral conversation as well. And so if you're someone that's reading this letter saying, hey, Onesimus needs to apologize. Like, where's Onesimus stepping up and taking responsibility for his actions? Well, that probably happened in person, verbally, between the two. Yeah, and it's important to note, too, this isn't sort of a point in the lesson or anything, but Onesimus becomes a Christian, and he's a completely changed individual. He has died to the old self. He rises to the new self. He's doing good work. That doesn't mean that his actions before becoming a Christian don't have consequences. Doesn't mean he doesn't still have to go be reconciled with those people. Doesn't mean he doesn't still have to ask forgiveness for those things that he did. So yeah, he's raised from the water as a new person, but it's not like everything that happened before that baptism just completely disappeared. It maybe does in your eyes in the Lord, and that red ledger of sin is wiped clean, as white as snow. But when it comes to living in a fallen world, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So because we just read the Colossians passage, let's talk about the connection to Colossians. So there's sort of two arguments that people make for why they believe that Philemon was in Colossae. And the first argument kind of goes like this. Both Philemon and Archippus are listed as recipients of Philemon, the letter, and so where one of these men is, the other must be also. Archippus is mentioned in Colossians, suggesting that he is in Colossae. Therefore, Philemon was also in Colossae. It's a common argument. It's addressed to both of them. Where one is, the other must be. Argument number 2 sort of goes like this. In Philemon, Paul says he is sending Onesimus back to Philemon. Makes sense? In Colossians, Onesimus is going to accompany Tychicus to Colossae, and Paul reminds the Colossians that Onesimus is one of your number. Therefore, Onesimus is going back to Colossae, where his master owner Philemon must be. So that's sort of the general common knowledge of this, which is Philemon must be in Colossae because of the common recipients and the connections between these two letters. With these arguments, it sort of seems clear that Philemon was at Colossae and Onesimus was going back there. Scholars have further argued that the close correspondence of these two statements, along with the 9 names in common between the two letters, leads us to conclude that both letters were written at the same time and delivered to the same place, Colossae, with Colossians written for the church and Philemon for the individual. However, I will say that David McClister does not buy into this argument because it sort of rests on one big assumption that there's really no solid proof for, and that's Colossians and Philemon were written at the same time. If they were written at the same time, those two arguments that we just presented make sense. If they were not written at the same time, then the whole sort of connection between them doesn't really make sense. It's also really important, this big sort of distinction there as well, which is that Paul says to the church in Colossae that Onesimus is one of your number. That's what your Bible says. But the literal translation of that is he is from you. So you can see the Greek up there. And so he has to remind the church in Colossae that he is from you, which David McClister sort of argues really just generally means that he was originally from Colossae, not that he was currently living in Colossae with Philemon, which sort of makes sense too, because if Philemon was a leader in the church and Onesimus was, working for Philemon, you would think it would make total sense that Colossians would already know Onesimus. They wouldn't have to be reminded by Paul that Onesimus is one of them. If they know him, it sort of makes sense that if Mark Cook leaves for a period of time and he comes back, we wouldn't need a letter saying, hey, remember, Mark is one of you. We're going to be like, yeah, we just saw him a few months ago. Of course he's one of us. But if he's going to some place where he hadn't lived before, or maybe he was born or lived for a brief period of time when he was young, Paul was saying, hey, church in Colossae, I don't know if you know this, but Onesimus here, who is going to show up at your doorstep with this letter to the Colossians with Tychicus, he is actually one of you. He is from there. It'd be like if someone from Minnesota came and visited the church here in Ellisville and said, actually, I was born here. I'm actually a Missourian. That's sort of saying he's from you. He is one of your number. So it's not really impactful on how you interpret the letter, but sort of those are the two sort of arguments on why Philemon was potentially in Colossae and why we say there's a connection, but also why some scholars say there might not be a connection between the two, and they're sort of just generally related. So let's move on. Here's the important thing, though. Here's what we know with confidence. There's a lot of sort of speculation there. Here's what we know for absolute fact on what's in the letter. Paul was in prison. Paul is in prison writing this letter. He is in a period of imprisonment. We don't know where, but he's currently in prison. 2, Paul hoped to be able to travel and to see Philemon soon. He says to prepare a room for him. So maybe Paul believes he's getting out of prison soon, and potentially he's in some sort of imprisonment that's close to wherever Philemon is located. Timothy was with him. Paul was writing to address a situation in which he had somehow become a participant. So when that person shows up at your doorstep and it's sort of a family situation at first, no matter what happened since then, it's no longer just a family situation. Paul was clearly and definitively a part of this. There was a slave named Onesimus. Onesimus, who had come to know Paul, left the household of Philemon to be with Paul. And it says left the household because some scholars say that potentially Philemon sent Onesimus to Paul to minister to him while he was in prison. And sort of the big conflict in the story is actually that Onesimus overstayed his time with Paul. And so potentially, Philemon said, Onesimus, go to Paul wherever he is, serve him in his imprisonment for a period of a month. And, Onesimus goes and he serves. And after that month is up, he says, I don't want to go back. I don't want to be a bondservant anymore. He's baptized. He's doing good work as a Christian. And maybe a year has now gone by. And so maybe that's the big conflict, is he didn't run away. He didn't steal. He was sent and somehow overstayed his welcome. So that's sort of one interpretation. But somehow, some way, what we know for a fact is Onesimus left the household of Philemon, and now he's with Paul. Onesimus obeyed the gospel under Paul's guidance. Onesimus is a Christian. That is not for debate whatsoever. He is a baptized believer. Paul found this newly converted slave to be useful to him, or potentially useful to him, in his work with the gospel. So this is really interesting as well. So not only was Onesimus a Christian, but he wasn't just a Christian in name only. He was doing good work. So much so that in the letter, Paul even makes a play on his name. Like, yeah, his name is useful. His name is Onesimus. But guess what? He's actually been really useful to me in my ministry. So Paul sort of makes a play on his name there and says he's actually a good worker in the kingdom. As a slave, Onesimus was not free to help Paul, either as he wished or as Paul wished. Onesimus' master and owner needed to be part of the conversation, and any decision about whether or how Onesimus could help Paul in the future had to come from the slave's owner. So this is a tough conversation, but Paul wants Onesimus to be there and to work with them and to be part of this conversation and be part of the work that's going on. But the truth of the matter is he was still a bondservant. And because of that, Onesimus could not continue in the same capacity working with Paul unless Philemon was at least part of the conversation. And this is the letter that sort of initiates that conversation. Paul wrote this letter asking Onesimus' owner to, quote, do the right thing. That's another interesting verse, and we can dive into that later in a different class. But Paul clearly thinks there's a right thing to do here. Although, unfortunately for us, he doesn't specify what the quote-unquote right thing is, which can be a tough interpretation of this letter. But Paul clearly thinks that there is a right thing to do here, a moral and good right thing that Philemon should do, that Paul is arguing that he needs to do, but he doesn't say what it is. And there's apparently some kind of personal problem between Onesimus and Philemon, some sort of conflict there. And finally, Onesimus himself is now returning to his owner, presumably bearing this letter as a show of good faith on both his part and Paul. So he shows up to Philemon carrying this letter from Paul. So this is sort of the key point to sort of come from those takeaways, which is imposing an external framework on this letter will only result in misleading it. There's 25 verses here, and a lot of things that we don't know. If you approach reading this letter and start off in your head saying, I bet this is an anti-slavery letter. This is a letter that Paul is going to write, and it's just going to tear apart slavery and condemn it. And you impose that on the letter, you might find it in the letter because it's so ambiguous, but you're not letting the word and letting Paul speak to you what he wants to do. You're sort of imposing your own external framework. If you impose on it sort of any sort of pre-assumptions or things that you want Paul to say, you could probably find it in the letter, but you're going to misinterpret and misread it. So let's not do that. So let's talk about real quickly what the elephant in the room was between Paul and Philemon. We're not going to get through everything I had prepared for today. That's totally fine, but we'll go as far as we can before 45 hits. So the elephant in the room, what happened? What had Onesimus done that made Paul think he needed to intercede and offer to bear the burden himself? The short answer that we must consistently remind ourselves of is that we do not know. But there are 6 ways to sort of imagine what happened. And we sort of mentioned some of these. 1, Onesimus' master, and possibly the church as well, sent Onesimus to Paul. We sort of discussed that possibility already. Onesimus ran away from his master and was captured and ended up being imprisoned. Onesimus ran away, was found or met by Paul, and this friend brought Onesimus to Paul. Onesimus ran away and could not survive on the run, and so he found shelter with Paul. It's an interesting possibility to consider. Onesimus was seeking asylum from Philemon. Perhaps Philemon maybe was a cruel master, And so he knew that he could find comfort and protection with Paul, so he ran to Paul. And finally, another possibility is on his own, Onesimus had come to Paul, whom he hoped would help him to be reunited with his master. Perhaps Onesimus really wants to seek that reconciliation. And so he sort of came to Paul and said, I don't know how to deal with this situation. And Paul sort of guided him and sort of helped to try and resolve it. Yes and no. So, yeah, so like I said in the very beginning, Philemon was definitely a good person, at least what we can see from Paul appealing to him. But is Paul putting on a little bit of flattery to sort of get Philemon to do what he wants and maybe exaggerating the truth a little bit, potentially? He still owned bondservants, and so it's not like these bondservants were free to do what he wanted. So potentially, Onesimus became a Christian, and maybe Philemon was treating him with disrespect before, and Philemon was worried that, if he became a Christian, the disrespect in the same previous relationship would take place, and so he goes to Paul and sort of seeks asylum in that way. It's definitely a possibility. Perhaps, because of the things we talked about, it's not the most likely possibility, but it's definitely one thing to consider. So the text of Philemon itself explicitly mentions none of these scenarios. That is, every one of them is a pure guess, an attempt to fill in the blanks so that we might have a more precise sense of what Paul wrote in this letter. But sort of as was just brought up, how do these different situations potentially change how we interpret the text here? If one of these situations was the truth and sort of was the initial conflict here, does it change how we read the letter at all? Cool. Thank you all for considering this letter with me today, and come back next Sunday with eagerness to study some more. Thank you all.